Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Finance Simplified, the official podcast for Street Fins. We're here to break down the world of finance for you to understand it from a relatable perspective with discussions with experts. This is episode 23, and today I have Alex Patel with me again. How have you been since our last episode?
Hey Rohan, I've been pretty busy wrapping up the school year, but you've been done for a little while now, right?
Yep, I moved down to LA about 2 weeks ago. I'm currently staying at one of USC's off-campus apartments, and so far, it's been a good experience.
Great to hear. Starting off summer break on a strong note.
Right. And if you listen to our special message, then you'll know that we want to use this podcast to help out as much as possible with those affected in India. If you're listening to this podcast and are based in India and need support, please let us know by emailing us at fspodcast@streetfins.com and tell us about your situation. We use our resources and network to help in any way we can.
We also want to remind you to follow us on social media at StreetFins on Twitter and Instagram for updates, and to sign up for our newsletter Finance Simplified for simplified weekly recaps, finance tips, and updates about the podcast.
So Alex, the topic of today's episode is simplifying business education. What's this topic all about?
Well, we know that many of our listeners are interested in learning about how to further their financial education. One way to do that is to have a broader business education, whether that's in university as an undergrad or grad student or outside of university. We know many of our listeners are business students at various colleges in the world or are looking at a business education as a potential major.
Yep, business education is a popular choice for many students, but understanding what it's about can be hard at first. There's so much that can go into business education, and with so many people graduating with such an education, it's worth understanding what it's all about.
Right. And we'll be making this topic a two-part conversation, so this episode is part 1, and we'll be releasing part 2 in 2 weeks from when this drops. Before we continue, I want to give a shout out to Justin Hinkston for guessing this week's guest. Justin, great job in figuring out who it was and sending us your guest so quickly. Additionally, we just want to remind you that if you are learning from our episodes and want to keep supporting what we're doing, we'd be eternally grateful if you gave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
We'd also really love to know what feedback you have for us. So fill out the feedback form in the description to let us know how we're doing and what you would like to see from us going forward. We'll be teasing the next guest at the end of part 2, but this part 1 episode will go into the basics of business education, differences between undergrad and MBA, and much more. Our guest is an incredibly successful and highly regarded academic and business thought leader who is most well known for his role as the Dean of the Wharton School of Business and the Marshall School of Business. So, let's just get to simplifying. From the minds of the students at StreetFins, this is Finance Simplified, the podcast that simplifies the seemingly complex and confusing world of money. I'm your host, Rohan Gupta. Business education is one of the most popular types of education in the world.
Business education. Students still in business school.
Our guest today is Geoffrey Garrett, and he's the current Dean of the USC Marshall School of Business and the former Dean of the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. His background and career are both so impressive that I think I'll just let him introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, Rohan. My name's Geoff Garrett. Hi, everybody. I'm Dean of the USC Marshall School of Business.
Great. And so, you have one of the more interesting kind of pathways into the world of business, especially because you come from the academic path into business. Most of the people we've had on the podcast before are really entrenched within the industry. And I know you are as well, but you have the more academic context because of your 10 years as professor or dean. So could you tell me how you actually got interested in business and how you actually pursued your career in business and how you ended up as not only the Dean of Marshall now, but also previously the Dean at Wharton?
Yeah, I've often said that I'm one of the weirdest business school deans there is, but it's increasingly hard for me to say that because being Dean at Marshall now is actually my 4th business school deanship. So in addition to USC and Wharton, I was also Dean of 2 business schools in Australia, my home country. But I'm a weird business school dean because I spent the first 15 plus years, 20 years of my academic career as a political scientist teaching and doing research. But as a political scientist, I was always really interested in the interaction between politics and the economy. And over time, I just came to think that the sort of public role of the private sector was getting bigger and bigger. So I was more intrigued by how business works and the impact of business on society. So it was kind of a macro perspective. And then within universities, I was an academic, but I wanted to be more engaged in the real world. And I think business schools tend to be the most outwardly oriented, the most real world engaged parts of universities. So on both dimensions, it proved a kind of natural transition for me in the end. I was really interested in the ever expanding role of the private sector. And within a university, I wanted to be engaged in the real world. So business schools just made sense. And I was really fortunate, obviously, to have had the opportunity to be the dean at wonderful schools on both coasts of the US and across the Pacific in Australia too.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so, going through this whole tenure from the academic path, right? Was there any kind of unique insight into the business world that you gained purely, I wouldn't say 100% purely, but mostly because of your experience coming from the academic path rather than, maybe a career path from actual industry coming into learning business? Was there any kind of unique perspective you developed on business education and just like any kind of unique insights that developed as a result of that academic path?
Yeah, I think so. And the way I think about it is that I'm just a very macro person. So I always think about it outside in. What is the role of business in society? Whereas a lot of people, if you grow up in a particular industry, or maybe even if you're a finance professor or a marketing professor, you have an inside out perspective. You start micro and go macro. For me, it was always going in the other direction. So, the two words that we haven't used yet that I think the really big ones for me from a macro perspective, technology and globalization. If I think about my adult life, there's no doubt that the two biggest forces in the world have been globalization and information technology. And as an academic, I was thinking about the impact of that on society and how governments were going to respond and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's just a different perspective from somebody who grew up in an accounting firm or was an accounting professor.
Perfect. Yeah, you really brought up some good points. I think, we're starting to think about business in terms of its actual impact on society and as well as sort of how it meshes with other topics. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'd like to really get to know the underpinnings of the business education. And really, I don't think there's anyone better to speak with, but, I'd love to know, what does it mean to get a business education? And, why do colleges offer it? What differentiates it from maybe a traditional economics or management science degree?
Yeah, Alex, really good questions. So let me answer in two different ways. The first way is that I have a simple sentence for how I think about business education, which is that business education gives you the skills to turn ideas into outcomes. And I like that sentence because for two reasons. One, ideas can come from anywhere. You're both really interested in business, but you're not taking business degrees. I think business schools have a symbiotic relationship with the rest of universities because great ideas can come from anywhere. What's distinctive about business education is the discipline to take full advantage of your idea, not to squander it, to make sure that great ideas get turned into great outcomes and then outcomes that change the world. So that's my first perspective on what business education is. From a kind of business model standpoint, I think undergraduate business degrees are currently the biggest degree in American higher education. It's something like 1 in 5 degrees is an undergraduate business degree. And I think that the demand for undergraduate business is actually going to go up post-pandemic. And the reason for that is that, students and families are obviously really concerned about the cost of higher education. And if you're going to pay a high price for education, you really need to get value from it. And I think undergraduate business delivers a lot of value because we have historically been more concerned about careers and career pathways than quote unquote traditional parts of universities. A traditional liberal arts education, I guess, is the clearest example. So because we've been focused on careers, I think business schools are very well placed for the kind of, the questioning of the value proposition that's been happening in society. And maybe the last, I said I would say two things, but let me say a third thing, which is that, we now talk a lot about active learning, right? Yes, there's a whole bunch of important stuff that you learn in a classroom from textbooks or from lectures, but we also know that a lot of the highest impact stuff for students is applying things you learn in the classroom outside in the real world. And I think that the active learning philosophy has also been a core attribute of business schools for a long time. So I actually think coming out of the pandemic that the demand for high quality undergraduate business education is just going to be unprecedentedly high.
Yeah, some really great insights there. And so you mentioned that the undergraduate business education is extremely popular, probably the most popular major in the US right now. And so I'd like to understand maybe why we talk about business in such a general way. And then what are some of the ways you can really specialize your business education? So, when should someone make the decision to specialize? And have you seen really dual degree programs become much more popular? I know at USC they have a lot of dual degree programs for pairing business with maybe an engineering background or a liberal arts background. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Alex, really good question. So on the dual degree side, I think there are great opportunities. And again, it goes back to my overall perspective, which is that business is about the discipline of turning ideas into outcomes, and the ideas can come from anywhere. So if you've got coding skills and you've got an app, you want to figure out how to turn your app into something that can endure, the way that you and Rohan have done with your website and everything else. Those are business skills, right? There are technical skills at the bottom, but you need a lot of business skills. How do we keep the eyeballs? How do we potentially monetize eyeballs? The kind of things that you have to think about in the tech sector. That's a natural marriage between computer science and business, but it's certainly not limited to that. I'll give you a USC example. As I think you both know, USC has probably the leading film school in the country, if not the world here, the School of Cinematic Arts. We have a business of cinematic arts degree for our undergraduates, which is, a fusion between those two disciplines. But if you think about it there, right, I mean, the world of entertainment is being completely disrupted by technology. On the one hand, we've democratized content production, but on the other hand, the distribution channels are just going through the roof, right? Do you stream things? Is it all mobile first? What's the future of in-person versus online viewing of entertainment? All of those issues. So I think wherever you look, if you have this frame that says business is about the discipline of turning ideas into outcomes, you just find really interesting opportunities for dual degrees, joint programs, etc. But the other thing that I would say more generally about business skill sets right now is that most careers require both more technical skills and more soft skills, leadership skills than ever before. So it's a 1-2 punch, right? You can't just be a really good coder. You've also got to be able to recruit, manage, and lead diverse teams, for example. It's that combination of hard and soft skills that everyone wants right now. And business schools can provide that, but we can also get a bunch of the technical skills from other schools, like an engineering school, for example. And as you know, it's not only USC and Penn, where I was previously, but in a lot of places now, that collaboration between engineering and business is a real sweet spot. And actually, I think in some ways that's even more true outside the US than it is inside the US. To take the two biggest examples, in China and India, certainly my experience is that it's that combination, technology and business, that is the winning one in the world's two largest countries and some of the fastest growing economies.
That's a great point. And it's cool to see that it's not limited just to the US, but also, as you mentioned, China and India too, and probably other countries, even in Europe too. One of the other questions we had is a lot of people who are listening to this podcast, it's called Finance Simplified. And many of our listeners are students like me and Alex. And many of them are also thinking about what to maybe major in college, right? So when we just focus in on business, right? And most schools, either if you're interested in finance, right, you either go to their business school and maybe specialize in finance like you do at Wharton or even at USC, or if they don't have a business school, you do the econ degree or something similar. But within that business major, finance is just one of the specializations. There's many different kinds of specializations, from marketing to operations to many other things too. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting about business is, again, as you mentioned, it's general. It's this discipline of turning ideas into outcomes. And it's not a field like biology or physics where there's like these hard and set laws, but there are some core principles within business education, I think, that are like independent of a certain specialization within business. So independent of specializing in marketing or finance. So could you talk about what some of those core principles, core kind of teachings for business are generally? And maybe thinking of like decision making or adaptation. What are some of these kind of core principles that business education, regardless of what you specialize in, what it teaches?
So lots of potential reactions to that question, Rohan, which I think is a great one. Let me first go in a direction that you probably wouldn't anticipate. If you try to understand the kind of core mindsets that inform a lot of what happens in business schools, the mindsets are either economics or psychology. Right. And obviously, the economic principles in finance, you both, and I think all of your audience would get that completely. But, if you also dig a little bit deeper to take one of the largest disciplines in business schools, management, right? A lot of management is really applied social psychology in an organizational context. So I think the social sciences in general, and business schools are a good example of this. There's really a healthy tension between an economistic perspective, which tends to be about rationality, intentionality, strategy, and a kind of social psychological perspective, which is about hearts and minds campaigns. People aren't always rational, framing effects, things like that. And so I think all good business schools have a lot of both of that. There's a very heavy economistic thinking underpinning, but then sitting side by side with that, you have a lot of social psychology. Having said that, the difference between an economics department and a finance department, or a psychology department and a management department, is just how applied they are, right? So, social psychology experiments tend to put a bunch of college students in a lab and see how they react in certain circumstances. There are pluses and minuses to that, but one of the minuses is it's not embedded in an organizational context. If you do that kind of thing in a business school, you're going to tend to want to know a lot more about what happens within an organization. Similarly, in economics, the core principles of economics, I think, are incredibly powerful, but you can't just take economic principles and say you understand the financial markets. There's a lot of context that you need to make that work. So I've spoken for a while there about the sort of applied social science side of business schools. If you just dive into disciplines, thinking about the core of all big business schools is probably 4 areas, and then some business schools add to that. Everyone's got a big management program. Everyone has a big finance and accounting. Everybody has marketing. And then the 4th one is sort of, historically, it's been operations based, which was closer to engineering, supply chain, and things like that. But now that's becoming more like business analytics and coding. So those are really the big 4. And then a place like Marshall, we have a very large, as I think you both know, entrepreneurship program, which is increasingly the case in lots of business schools too. At the Wharton School, we had a management of health department. That's not true of most business schools. So you've got this core, and then different schools add things on top of that. But academically, I would say we're talking about applied social science, but the context of the applications really, really matters. And the only way you can do the applied work is to have a constant interplay between the business school and the real world of business. And I do think it's not so much the intellectual architecture, it's the fact that we want to have constant two-way engagement with what's happening in the real world. That's the most distinctive feature of business schools.
Yeah, really, really comprehensive overview of undergrad and some of the core principles of business education. I kind of want to step forward and talk about the MBA, and that's maybe the next logical place we'll go. And I want to sort of set the stage with 2 questions. So one is, when should a person get an MBA? And does that depend on what your undergraduate education is? Maybe if you got a BBA or an undergrad business degree. And then number 2 is, where do you see the value of an MBA right now? Is it mainly the network? Is it the education? Does it differ person to person?
Great questions. Multiple questions there, Alex. So let me try to be a little briefer in responding. I think this is true both of Marshall at USC and Wharton at Penn. If you do a really high quality undergraduate business degree, the likelihood that you're going to need to do an MBA later is pretty low. I don't know how low is low, but the better an undergraduate business degree you get, the closer it actually is to an MBA experience, even though you're doing it, maybe 8 to 10 years earlier. So I expect that we'll find a lot of Marshall students and a lot of Wharton students don't come back and do an MBA. That was not the case 20 or 30 years ago, when MBA was really a rite of passage for anybody who wanted to have a successful corporate career. And in fact, what used to be the case was that banks and consulting firms and other places would not only recommend to people who worked for them that they would go back to business school, often the firms would pay for it as well. That just doesn't happen nearly as much today. And I think that there are two reasons for that. I've articulated one, which is the better your undergraduate business degree, maybe the less you need an MBA. But the second is the concept of opportunity costs. If you're killing it in your career at 27, you might not want to leave your job, and your employer probably doesn't want to leave your job, because if you step out for 2 years to go back to business school, those are 2 lost years. So that's the pathway that says if you can get your business training earlier, maybe you won't need an MBA. But the flip side of that is the one that I think you were thinking about correctly, which is, what about people who didn't have business training as part of their undergraduate degree? And they're the people for whom an MBA, I think, is of very high value. And I'd actually go further than that and to say that I see 2 kinds of MBA students right now who are getting enormous value from MBA programs. The first is career reset, career change types of moves where you had some technical skills, but you want to move into a different industry, or you want to move from being a technical person to being more of a manager and leader. And those people want to do MBAs and get enormous value from it. The other kind of person is somebody who's working in a corporate environment, but wants to think about being an entrepreneur. And I just see lots of MBA students who are working on their own startups at the same time as their students. They get a really good and supportive network. They get a really good education. They might want to be entrepreneurs, but they know that doing an MBA is an insurance policy, because maybe their startup doesn't work out and they want to get a good job at the end of 2 years, and MBA will give that to them. So I think that kind of career reset path, career change path on the one hand, and hey, I want to go from working for somebody else to being an entrepreneur, for those people, MBA is very high value. There's a lot of talk about this kind of crisis of the MBA. I actually think that that's overstated quite a bit. What we're seeing right now, for example, is that demand for MBAs are through the roof. And what that shows you is that there's a kind of a counter-cyclical feature to MBA. When the economy is going really, really well, the opportunity costs of getting an MBA are higher, so maybe applications go down. But when there's more uncertainty in the economy, or in the last year, a big downturn, that's when the opportunity costs are lower, and people say, now's a fantastic opportunity for me to reinvest in my own skills. And we're going to see that not only this year, but in the next few years. You also asked, and I'll end here with, what's the value of an MBA? How much of it is the sort of technical stuff you learn in the classroom? How much is the network? I think that the honest answer there is both. Both parts of that are incredibly powerful. And, people in business schools really get that. And I think the networking side is 2-dimensional. One is the relationships you develop with your classmates, which tend to be lifelong and both personal and professional. But the other is what I would call the vertical network, where if you're in a business school, you get to interact with the people who were in the school 5 years before you, who can give you a real understanding of how to start your careers. You might also be able to interact with somebody who's 25 years out, who can be your mentor. So I think we can't downplay the value of the network, but the value of the network is all built on the core educational foundations of the school. So again, I think, yes, the MBA market is changing and there are a lot of subtleties to that. But I think this notion of the crisis of the MBA, particularly for the top schools, it's just a little bit overstated.
Hey everyone, that was the end of part 1 of our 2-part interview with Geoffrey Garrett on simplifying business education. We'll be releasing part 2 of our interview in about 2 weeks from when this releases. But the first half of the conversation was absolutely incredible. Alex, what were some of the key takeaways from this first part?
I think one key takeaway is in understanding what a business education offers compared to education in similar fields like economics and management science. While economics and management science may delve into more theoretical topics, business education is all about learning how, as Geoffrey says, to turn ideas into outcomes, meaning it's very much engaged with the real world and has an emphasis on practicality.
Right. And in addition to that, at its foundation, business education is really a kind of applied social science with heavy emphasis on the applied part. Part of that application lends itself to specializing your business education, whether that's in a specific part of business like finance or marketing, or being multidisciplinary by studying a complementing field like engineering.
I also agree with this perspective on MBAs. It's not required for a top finance or management role anymore. Now, with undergraduate business programs, many students have the knowledge to pursue a career without needing an MBA. That being said, an MBA provides tremendous value to those without an undergrad business education in providing both an education and a network.
Agreed. Well, Alex, that wraps up our part 1 conversation and takeaways. What can we expect from part 2?
We'll be talking about the impact of COVID-19, as well as Dr. Garrett's thoughts on the future of globalization and business education.
Part 2 will be dropping on June 15th, which is 2 weeks from now. We'll talk to you all then. Hey guys, I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. It truly means the world to us. If you like this episode and others, let us know by subscribing and giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and following us on Spotify. Share us with your friends and check us out on Instagram and Twitter, both at StreetFins. You can also follow me on Twitter at RohanInvest. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please email fspodcast@streetfins.com. Thanks once again to Dr. Geoffrey Garrett for his insights today. I hope you understand the topic of business education in a more simplified way. Once again, we're really happy that you're taking the initiative to learn finance and to better your future. If you haven't already, we highly encourage you to check out streetfins.com for articles, videos, and other content. Join the StreetFins community and tell your friends about us so that they can learn about finance too. We'll talk to you next time on Finance Simplified.